Most Wanted now has closure after police finally found the man who killed his son. 6-year-old Adam Walsh was murdered and decapitated in 1981. He's the son of John Walsh, the host of America's Most Wanted.
For 27 years, we've been asking, who could take a 6-year-old boy and murder him and decapitate him? Who? We needed to know. We needed to know. And today we know.
Welcome to Crime Watch Central USA, where we never stop digging. Every week, real cold cases, real justice. New here, hit like and subscribe. Let's uncover the truth. The following program contains content that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised.
It is noon on a Tuesday in July. Inside a Sears department store in Hollywood, Florida, the lights are too bright, the air is too still, and the sound of children playing video games fills the toy section like any other summer afternoon. A 6-year-old boy stands at the center of it. He is waiting his turn. He doesn't know it yet, but this moment is already ending. Across the store, his mother is only a few aisles away, and in less than 15 minutes, he will be gone. Not missing in a way that makes sense, not lost in a way that can be corrected. Gone in a way that would take America decades to fully understand. And this is the case of Adam Walsh.
On July 27, 1981, a child disappeared from one of the busiest shopping centers in Florida. There was security, there were employees, there were witnesses, there was even a police station directly across the street. And yet, a 6-year-old boy walked out of visibility and never returned. What followed would become one of the most controversial, painful, and influential missing child cases in American history. Because this wasn't just a disappearance. It became a system failure. And every failure would stack on top of the last until there was nothing left but questions. Adam Walsh was born in 1974. He was 6 years old, small for his age, quiet by nature, and deeply attached to routine. He wasn't the kind of child who wandered far. He didn't like unfamiliar places. He didn't speak easily to strangers. Those who knew him described him as careful, observant, a child who stayed close to what felt safe. He loved simple things: television cartoons, baseball, drawing, and most of all, his parents. His father, John Walsh, was working in hotel development in Miami. His mother, Walsh, was studying and building her own identity while raising her only child. Their life, on the surface, looked stable, ordinary, predictable. That illusion would collapse in a single afternoon. On July 27th, Adam went with his mother to the Hollywood Mall. The plan was simple: 2 errands, a store visit, and then home. They entered Sears through the north entrance. The toy department was crowded. Children gathered around a new Atari console. Adam stopped there. He didn't ask to stay. He didn't argue. He simply became absorbed. Reve made a decision millions of parents would recognize instantly. She told him she would be nearby. She would return shortly. The distance between them was small. The visibility was high. Security was present. Nothing about the environment suggested danger. She walked away, and Adam stayed. When she returned, the toy section was empty. Not just missing Adam, missing all the children who had been there. The Atari console sat unused, controllers resting where hands had been moments earlier. She called his name. No answer. She searched aisle by aisle. Still nothing. At first, it felt like confusion, then concern, then urgency. By the time she reached customer service, the store had already begun broadcasting announcements. Adam Walsh, please come to the front of the store. No response. The second announcement followed, then the third, each one heavier than the last. Something was wrong, but no one yet understood how wrong it was. What investigators would later struggle with was not just what happened after Adam disappeared. It was what happened immediately after. A short time before Adam was last seen, a group of children argued in the toy department. A store security guard intervened. The children were split up. Some were escorted out one exit. Others were directed toward another. One of them was Adam. He was 6 years old. He followed instructions. He left through a door that did not lead back to his mother, and within minutes, he was outside the store, alone, in a parking lot. By the time police were called, nearly 2 hours had passed. The station was across the street. Response was not immediate. There was confusion about whether the child had wandered off, whether this was even a crime. In those early hours, assumptions shaped decisions, and those decisions shaped everything that came after. Search efforts began, but the first critical window was already gone. 4 days later, a man hiking with his sons made a discovery in a wooded area miles from the mall. Beneath branches and dirt, weighted by stones, was a body. It was Adam. The condition of the scene made one thing clear immediately. This was not random. This was deliberate. And whoever did this had taken steps to ensure the child would not be found quickly. The investigation shifted from missing child to homicide, but answers did not follow. Police interviewed hundreds of people, family members, employees, witnesses. Leads were collected and discarded. But forensic science in 1981 was limited. There was no DNA matching system, no national missing child database as we know it today. Evidence was preserved but not fully understood. And slowly, the case began to stall. Not because it lacked importance, but because it lacked tools. While investigators worked, Adam's parents faced something else entirely: uncertainty, then grief, then public attention, then scrutiny. They appeared on national television, they made appeals, they searched endlessly. And through it all, one question remained unanswered. Who took their child? Investigators initially focused on people close to the family. This is standard procedure in child homicide cases. One individual became a point of attention due to proximity and personal connection to the household. He was questioned, he was tested, he was cleared. But the investigation had already begun to drift into complexity instead of clarity. Time was working against them. What made the case so difficult was not just the crime itself, it was the structure around it. There was no unified child alert system, no coordinated national response network, no rapid identification framework. If a child disappeared, information moved slowly, sometimes too slowly to matter. Adam Walsh's case would later become a driving force in changing that system. But at the time, those systems did not exist. As media attention grew, the case expanded beyond Florida. Searches intensified, volunteers joined, billboards were printed, rewards increased. But leads became inconsistent. The investigation began to spread across multiple theories, each one leading somewhere, none of them leading to resolution. When Adam's body was found, confirmation came through multiple methods: dental comparison, witness identification, forensic analysis. There was no ambiguity about identity, but there was still no clarity about the person responsible. The case now had a victim. It had a crime scene, but it did not have a conclusion. The autopsy confirmed cause of death involving trauma and asphyxiation, but forensic interpretation in the early 1980s had limitations. Evidence existed, but interpretation frameworks were still developing. What investigators needed most, a direct link between suspect and crime, did not exist in a usable form. And over time, evidence degradation and procedural gaps would further complicate future analysis. As years passed, the investigation continued in fragments. New suspects emerged. Old suspects were revisited. Some were ruled out quickly. Others remained controversial. But no charges were filed. No trial occurred. And slowly, the case became a reference point for failure rather than resolution. While the case stalled, Adam's father changed direction. He began advocating for missing children reform. He worked with lawmakers. He pushed for national systems to track and identify missing children faster. What began as a personal tragedy became a national movement, And over time, legislation changed. New systems were built. Alerts were created. Databases were formed, all in response to the gaps this case exposed. Years later, organizations would estimate that hundreds of thousands of children were helped through systems inspired by this case. Law enforcement procedures were rewritten. Public awareness increased. And missing child response time improved dramatically. But none of that changed the origin. A single afternoon in a department store, a decision to step away for minutes, and a moment that never recovered. Adam Walsh was 6 years old. He did not disappear because of distance. He did not vanish because of complexity. He disappeared because a system failed to see risk in time. Everything that came after, every law, every reform, every awareness campaign began in that failure. Not in justice, in absence, and in the unanswered question that started it all. What happened to Adam Walsh? If this case stayed with you, subscribe to Crime 95 for more real investigative true crime documentaries. Because some cases are not just stories, they are turning points. And some names are never just history, they are warnings.
And in that moment, you can see how things change for Daniel. He suddenly goes quiet. His posture changes, from his confident hands to now shoulders slightly hunched, and his movements slower, more guarded. As he's guided into the back of the patrol car, he doesn't resist. He just sits there in silence, because deep down, he may already know. After decades of running around, investigators had finally found their suspect. But how did he even end up here? Because the secret he's been carrying since a New Year's Eve 35 years ago is about to catch up to him.
And now, let's rewind. 35 years. Back to a New Year's Eve celebration. Back to a night that began with music, crowded bars, and people counting down to a brand new year. Back to a young mother who believed her life was finally moving in the right direction. The cigarette hit the pavement without a second thought. A small piece of trash tossed from a truck window on an ordinary afternoon in Pensacola, Florida. To most people, it meant nothing. But hidden nearby, investigators watched closely. For months, they had followed the man behind the wheel. They had studied his movements, reviewed decades-old files, and reconstructed a crime that had happened before some of the detectives on the case were even born. Now, everything depended on a single piece of discarded evidence. If they were right, the DNA on that cigarette would finally identify the man who had escaped justice for 35 years. The man had no idea. No idea that detectives were waiting. No idea that science had finally caught up with him. And no idea that before the day was over, he would be sitting in an interrogation room being confronted with the murder of a young mother whose family had spent decades waiting for answers. Her name was Tonya McKinley. And this is how a New Year's Eve celebration turned into one of Pensacola's longest-running cold cases. Before we continue, viewer discretion is advised. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week, we uncover real investigations, forgotten victims, and the cases that refuse to stay buried. Now let's go back to New Year's Eve, 1984. Long before she became a cold case file, Tonya Etheridge McKinley was a daughter, a friend, and a mother. Friends described her as energetic and outgoing. She was the kind of person who could strike up a conversation with anyone, the center of attention without even trying, the person who brought life into a room. If there was laughter nearby, chances were Tonya was responsible for it. But beneath her outgoing personality was someone carrying responsibilities far bigger than most people her age. She was raising an 18-month-old son, and by the end of 1984, she was trying to rebuild her life. Tonya had recently left an abusive relationship. According to those closest to her, she was determined to move forward. She wanted stability. She wanted a better future. Most importantly, she wanted to create a safe life for her child. For the first time in a long time, things seemed to be improving. A new year was approaching, and with it came hope. No one around her could have imagined that she was only hours away from becoming the victim of a crime that would remain unsolved for more than 3 decades. December 31st, 1984. Pensacola was alive with celebration. Bars were crowded. Music filled the air. People gathered with friends and family to welcome the start of a new year. Tonya joined the festivities like thousands of others across the city. Witnesses later reported seeing her at establishments near the University Mall area. She appeared relaxed, happy, social. Nothing about the evening suggested anything unusual. Nothing suggested danger. Investigators would later spend years trying to reconstruct her final movements. Who she spoke with, who she left with, where she went, and what happened during the final hours of her life. But the deeper they looked, the more frustrating the timeline became. Some people remembered seeing her. Others remembered conversations. But nobody could account for every minute. Somewhere during those missing hours, Tonya encountered the person responsible for her death. At the time, she likely had no reason to suspect anything. No reason to believe the night would end differently than countless others before it. But before sunrise, everything would change. The first day of 1985 began with a routine drive. A mother and daughter were transporting their sick dog to a veterinary appointment. As they traveled through Escambia County, something caught their attention. At first, it appeared to be debris, maybe discarded clothing, maybe an animal. But as they got closer, they realized it was neither. It was a person. Authorities were contacted immediately. Within a short time, investigators arrived at the scene. The victim was identified as 23-year-old Tonya McKinley. Detectives immediately noticed details that raised serious questions. Her shoes were missing. Her clothing was dirty. A blue towel was found nearby. Personal belongings remained at the scene. And perhaps most importantly, investigators began to suspect that the location where Tonya was found was not where the crime had originally occurred. Evidence suggested her body had been moved. Whoever was responsible appeared to have transported her there. It was a troubling discovery. Not only had a young woman lost her life, but detectives were now dealing with someone who had taken deliberate steps to distance the crime from its original location. That meant critical evidence could be miles away, and every passing hour reduced the chances of finding it. Investigators immediately launched a large-scale effort to determine what had happened. Friends were interviewed. Witnesses were tracked down. Bars and businesses were visited. Detectives attempted to retrace every step Tonya had taken during the final hours of her life. At the same time, forensic evidence was collected. Biological samples, fibers, physical evidence recovered from the scene. Everything that might identify a suspect. But there was a major problem. The year was 1985. Modern DNA profiling did not yet exist. Investigators possessed evidence that could potentially identify the killer. They simply lacked the technology needed to use it. It was like having the answer locked inside a safe with no key. The evidence remained. The science did not. As weeks became months, investigators followed every lead available. Potential suspects were examined. Tips were investigated. Witnesses were re-interviewed. Yet every path seemed to end the same way, with more questions and fewer answers. Eventually, the case began to cool. The evidence remained locked away, waiting for a future generation of investigators, waiting for technology that had not yet been invented, waiting for someone who refused to let the case die. And while the investigation stalled, the person responsible continued living freely, building a life, working jobs, meeting people, blending into society, all while Tonya's family continued waiting for answers. Answers that wouldn't come for another 35 years. For Tonya's family, the years that followed were filled with uncertainty. Birthdays came and went. Holidays passed. Life moved forward. But the questions never disappeared. Who did this? Why? And would they ever be found? As the decades passed, detectives changed. Investigators retired. Evidence was transferred between departments. Case files collected dust. To many people, it seemed unlikely the crime would ever be solved. Yet one thing never changed. The evidence. Hidden within that evidence was the identity of the killer. The problem was that nobody yet knew how to unlock it. For years, the answer sat silently inside police storage, waiting. And eventually, science caught up. The breakthrough that investigators had hoped for since 1985 was finally about to arrive. And when it did, it would change everything.